of the state. And secondly, our sense is looking historically, going back to the Populist Party, the Readjusters, Henry Howe, all these different things in Virginia history, is actually when communities of color are and democracy is less suppressed or more open, we actually move towards better government and more progressive government with more goods and resources and openness for all of us instead of just a few. So we really think it's critically important. What I want to do is basically give two examples out of our work. They're local examples because that's where we can point to both greater success and failure as examples of how districting impacts communities of color, or how. And one is Prince William County in 2010, the last cycle, 2011. Essentially, there was a concentration of Latino voting age people who lived in and around Manassas in Prince William, and our contention was that if you kept that potential voting block together, there'd be a greater chance you could create a district that had roughly 1/3 Latino voters and would have a strong influence, if not even a capacity, to elect a representative of color, or at least influence who was in there. And instead, and it was interesting how the backroom bartering must have happened, you ended up with almost exactly divided three districts. The Latino population in the Manassas area was broken up into thirds, almost equal thirds. It must have been, again, backroom bartering. That resulted in the Latino community and community of interest and voting population being split equally into 3 separate districts as a way to dilute their voting power. And that was a unsuccessful example of trying to come up with districts that were fairest and most empowering to communities of color. A more positive example was, I think it went back to I think it was 1990 actually, in the city of Alexandria, which had moved from an appointed school district to a elected school district, or school board, sorry. And there was an opportunity, because it had been appointed prior to that, there was an opportunity to actually come up with something that would be most empowering. In Alexandria, a city of about 150,000 people, had a people of color percentage of around 40% at that point, plus or minus a few points. And so we thought there was an opportunity perhaps to even get a person of color majority on the school board, which as an appointed board in recent years it had often been that way. And so we looked at it starting from ground zero and sort of we looked at single member districts and drew 9 districts in the city of Alexandria, and there was no more than basically 3 districts that we could come up with that would have close to, around 50% voters of color, or voting age population of color. We looked at large, and again, particularly based on voting participation rates and everything else, we didn't think you would end up with more than 2 or 3 seats that were represented by candidates of school board members or candidates of color. And so we ended up with a dividing Alexandria up into thirds, which had never been done before, but we divided Alexandria up into thirds. We basically created a third of the most affluent and basically 99% white section of the city, and the assumption would be there would probably be 3 white school board members or candidates coming out of there. And then we came up with two districts that also were thirds of the city, one that had an absolute majority of voters of color and the other that had a 40% voter of color representation. And the sense was you could actually, depending on, people need to get out and vote, people need to do work and organize, you could actually end up with a reasonable chance of getting, first of all, guaranteed strong community or voter of color representation, and possibly even a majority. And that's what the city of Alexandria ended up adopting. And, and subsequently it's gone up and down, but there's been a consistent 3 and often 4, sometimes no 5, not 5 yet, but at least 4 members who have been, of color, African American primarily. So that's an example of, I think, of how things can work if you go in with a creative mind and with the mindset that we're going to try and enhance, instead of suppressing, packing, diluting the power of voters of color, we're going to try to increase it. And our argument would be that actually when voters of color win, we all win. And that's sort of our perspective looking at at this redistricting process going on. And we appreciate the work that Brian in 2021 has been doing in terms of trying to move this forward. It is bold and audacious and also actually plausible. We think that's great.
Thanks, John. That's very kind. It is bold and audacious, right? But that's what we need to be doing to make a difference. So let's talk for a second about this current session and what went on. So the current session, the reason behind it was that the General Assembly and the governor were required by the court to redistrict before September 1st to find a way to unpack the African American voters of the 3rd Congressional District and do it at a fair way that would comply with the Voting Rights Act. The governor called the special session for August 17th. The Republicans didn't want that, but then they kind of stuck it to the governor with trying to unseat his judicial appointment, and all of a sudden that sucks all the air out of this. The Democrats introduced one official map that was kind of their map. Chap Peterson, also a Democratic senator, introduced another map that was his map. Either way, Democrats kind of know that you do any kind of reform to the congressional districts, and instead of from an 8-3, which is for you guys, it's a far right shift, so you guys can see this, far right shift for Congress, it would swing any kind of normal district or unpacking of the 3rd would swing it back to the center and give you at least one Democratic seat, if not 2. So Democrats were excited about this, and instead of actually doing anything for reform, they just put in their own gerrymanders. I'll tell you, both of the maps were better looking. They were better mathematically. You know, they split fewer counties and towns. They split fewer precincts. And we believe, though we never got the proof, we believe that they actually kept some communities of color together in a better way. The origin of them still isn't where we want it to be. We would like an independent commission to do this, or at least everybody would agree that not to use political data unless you need to for the Voting Rights Act. But the Republicans did not submit a map. They were looking to use the 17th as a day to set ground rules for that, and then to go forward and in a few weeks come back and put in their own map, and they were just going to pass it through likely on the 31st. But like I said, the judicial nomination fight sucked out all of the air from this discussion, and the Senate and Senate Democrats, in quite a brazen move that I kind of, from just a political junkie, pretty proud of them for doing, because they're not known for carrying these kind of moves out. They shut the session down with John Watkins coming to their aid, and then the Lieutenant Governor voting to break the tie. Pretty impressive. The ultimate result for reform, redistricting reform, is the same. We knew there wasn't going to be a map that was passed the General Assembly that the governor would sign. We knew this was going to the courts. The governor pretty much said so. All the leadership in the General Assembly said so. We weren't, so that the outcome isn't a surprise. How quickly it happened was a surprise. So the question is, what do we do now that we're in this space? One of the things we do is we can continue to call on the General Assembly to do this better. We can, as an organization, we can submit a amicus brief asking the court for better stuff. So if you are a member of an organization out here, I know pretty much all of you are, that's how you got on this call most likely, I would love to have other people sign on to this amicus that we write. We're not exactly sure what it's going to say yet, so I'm sorry I can't give you a better answer. But if you're interested in that and want to help out legally, we could use the help. We believe it won't cost anything. We've got a number of lawyers in our world that we think can write this and get it to the courts at an appropriate time. The other thing we could do is, and we're thinking through this right now, is the governor or the General Assembly, but let's say the governor could call an independent commission to do this right now. It would be advisory. It would be advisory and then an amicus to the court. But right now, if you're the courts and you're looking at, well, they didn't come up with one. We've got some Republican plans. We've got some Democrat plans that they'll submit. And then we've got this Governor's Commission from 2011 that drew these maps. It was a fairly impartial commission. It was a bipartisan group, and they drew some maps. Maybe they'll look at that. Well, those maps need to be updated with the latest and greatest political data for the Voting Rights Act analysis for Congressman Scott's district, and maybe that will help answer it. So we're exploring the call for that as well. That would be a smart move by the governor because he could have that commission and then update it appropriately and then it's a Republican commission at the end of the day. I mean, it's not a Republican commission, but it was appointed originally by a Republican. So there's that, and then give them better criteria to use. Our criteria bill, which is the kind of nonpartisan criteria that we push, our criteria bill was carried by John Watkins, a Republican in the Senate. It won unanimous support in the Senate, and even had a Republican vote for it in the House. It was defeated in the subcommittee. So there's ways to do this in a way that would politically get the governor what he wants, but also be a good government thing to do. And that's where we're looking for those kind of stars to align on those two things, because that makes the best opportunity for this.
I have a question.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. What effect will any of the change, specifically in the state districts, have? When would it go into effect, assuming the court chooses one? Would it go into effect this year, or would it be 2 years down the road for the current legislature in Virginia, and then obviously in the 2012 election, 2016 election for the House of Representatives?
Kenny, that's a good question. So the effects for Congress would go into effect immediately and be impacted for the 2016 election.
Right.
There's another case that is out there that is the same case of packing African American voters into districts that applies to the House of Delegates. There's 12 majority-minority House of Delegate seats, and they are all at 55% black VAP or more, and the court is looking at that as well as a racial gerrymander. What's great about that is that from just a purely like chance to get reform through, is that while the Speaker of the House is not thrilled with the courts redoing the districts, he's more happy with them redoing districts that don't have anything to do with his caucus, right? Because this is not, I mean, the members of Congress are not his people. His flock that he's trying to protect is in the House of Delegates. There's 67 members in the Republican caucus, 66 other members of the House of Delegates that are in his caucus. He doesn't want them to be defeated. But what could happen is that if the court comes back, which could happen any week now, or it could be a couple months, we don't know. If the court comes back and strikes down those lines as a racial gerrymander as well, and we have to unpack those districts, that puts the Speaker in a bit of a bind, because he's either has to pass a map that would comply with the court order and have Governor McAuliffe sign it, which is a tall order, or let it go to the courts. And if the courts redraw these House districts, there's no guarantee that once they redraw the districts that the Speaker will wake up in his own district anymore. And there's no guarantee that a lot of his members would wake up in their own district anymore, because the courts don't have to care at all about where incumbents live. They don't have to care at all about whether that district is 53% Republican or 58% Democrat or whatever. The courts can do whatever they want and impose a map on them, and so that's very scary. Additionally, there would likely be, to your point, Kenneth, there would likely be a special election for the House of Delegates seats that were affected, which would be a decent amount. That special election would be held likely in November of 2016, and the governor gets to pick the date. So he would obviously pick it on the presidential cycle. And currently there are 14 Republicans in the House of Delegates who sit in seats that were won by Obama and Kane. So there should be a fairly sizable pickup. Now, practically speaking, do not think that the Democrats are going to take back the House of Delegates. That would be, I mean, something crazy would have to happen for that. But you could imagine it being a much more close General Assembly. And you know, I'm personally a Democrat, but we're a multi-partisan organization, and sometimes, quite frankly, the Democrats make me less and less of one as I see what they do in redistricting reform some days. But they getting closer to equality in the House would make reform a lot easier. Because the Democrats in the House definitely want reform, and there are a handful of Republicans, and I believe a majority of Republicans who want reform too. But it just means we don't have to pick off quite as many from the caucus to get 51 votes through there. So it's quite an opportunity in 2016 and 2017. And what we're looking at is in 2016 for reform, we're looking at pushing just the criteria bill, which would be only eliminating political gerrymandering, because they won't hear a constitutional amendment in 2016. What they will hear is a constitutional amendment in 2017, and it takes a constitutional amendment to get an independent redistricting commission that has any teeth, that is actually binding. And so you can see how this sets up and plays very nicely going forward. So let's talk for a second. Happy to answer any other questions if people have strategy questions on how that all might play out. Granted, there's a lot of ifs in all of those statements that I've made, but that's one in a possibly likely path. So I think that will make the speaker come to the table and want to negotiate on what we can do to not have his caucus wiped out completely. But action things. So there's a lot of actions we can take. We already talked a little bit about court action, and if you all would want to help out on that, that would be great. There is organizing action that can take place. Every precinct around Virginia could have somebody having a petition out there signing for redistricting reform, could be informing voters. Now there's a couple different scenarios. One, you're in a district where there's a competitive race and maybe there's a difference between the two candidates. One supports reform and the other doesn't. We'll have that data out at the end of September or early October once people answer their candidate questionnaires and we do things like that. So that's one answer. You'd be out there, and we have a C4 that enables us to do that. The other opportunity, and what's more likely to happen, is you have two candidates who both support redistricting reform. And from that standpoint, great, go out there and do the exact same thing, except you don't have to say, you could say, both these candidates support it. Do you as well? Would you get involved in whatever organization, if it's one Virginia or others, to help support redistricting reform? And then three, there's a lot of chance, there's more often than not, there's going to be either a completely non-competitive race or a race where there's only one person on the ballot. Unfortunately, that happens a lot. And the message still applies, if not even more, there to say, would you like an alternative here? You know, and would you have to sign up for One Virginia 2021 or whatever to support redistricting reform? So those are opportunities we can do. We're going to coordinate that at least through our work, but we need other organizations around Virginia to help step up and do that. As you can imagine, there are a lot of precincts to do that. The other way you can do this is you can reach out to your legislator. We have an easy way on our website. If you go to our website /petition, you can sign the redistricting reform petition, and it will immediately email your state senator and state delegate, and you'll also be included in all of our list and work. The other way to do it is just talk to your neighbors, talk to your organizations, talk to your groups about this. We need organizations to join this coalition. We need local counties and towns and boards of supervisors to endorse this. We need people to understand how this matters to their votes and what this can really do to it, and especially districts that are traditionally have been carved up or have been disenfranchised either subtly or overtly over this need to stand up and speak for this, because this matters. Making our votes count. I mean, this is kind of the next step in that part, is so that we can have fair redistricting that really maximizes our votes instead of minimizes them. So those are the basic ways we can do this, folks. I know we've been on for a good little bit here, so I'd be happy to take other questions. I'm happy to stay on. I'll also email everyone who's been on this, as long as you provided an email address when you registered. I'll also follow up with an email, but I would love questions if you all have any.
I just have one question.
Go ahead, sir.
Is Virginia organizing part of your group?
Good question. I wish I could say they officially were. They've been taking on Medicaid expansion and focusing on that, but we would love for them to be more engaged in that. I know they've just kind of felt that their plate was full of a lot of good things, so we could use the help.
I'll contact them. I'm a member of down here.
Great, thank you. Appreciate that, Kim. Any other thoughts and questions? John, you got your hand raised. I don't know if that's an old hand raise.
That's an accidental hand. No problem.
Oh, it's an accidental hand? All right. Go back to muting you. Oh, there's a little puppy back there. John, Liss, you have anything else to add to this?
No, I think it's really important work, and the more we can get people involved, the better off we all be. I think it has huge impacts at the federal level, but I think even bigger at the state level, as we'll have if we actually had fair districts that were fully representative of the communities of color. I think we'd have a much better assembly for all of us. Yeah,
I agree. I think a lot of folks look towards competitiveness and political ideas. Let me add one other thought to this, because what matters in this also is that our coalition is so broad. I mentioned Tea Partiers, and a lot of people raise their eyebrows when I say that. In fact, I'm doing coffee with Dave Bratt at the end of this week, and I know a lot of people probably aren't. That's not their favorite congressional person we send. But what I will say is that we should have communities make that decision. And if you think about the community of the city of Richmond, if you drew a circle around the city of Richmond, that has enough population to support one state Senate district. Maybe you could do two if you wanted to draw a line down the boulevard and there's an east and a west end, but really it supports one senator. We have 3 in Richmond right now who represent Richmond, none of whom live there. One lives in Petersburg, one lives in Henrico, and one lives in Powhatan. So the districts are pretty carved up, and so does Richmond really have any representation? It's a good question. I actually like all those senators. They all support redistricting reform. Some of them support redistricting reform a lot. But that's the kind of scenario we're talking about. But if you kept Richmond whole and just had one senator there, it's a pretty liberal city. We would elect consistently Democrats. And that's not per se competitive, but that's what that community is and would want, and that matters. And if you would go out to Powhatan and you'd put Powhatan and Goochland in the Senate district, they would elect mostly Republicans, and it would probably be somebody fairly conservative. And while that's not maybe what everybody would want, that's at least what that community is about. And there are plenty of places in Virginia that will be competitive because Virginia ultimately is a purple state, but there are plenty of places that, or there are at least a decent number of places that won't be competitive if you do fair redistricting. But what's important to know is that community won't be carved up artificially. It will actually be electing somebody that represents them, which is a fact that's important to know as you talk to people about this on the far right and the far left, and you have this conversation, is that it doesn't mean everything's going to be competitive and we're all going to have a bunch of moderates there. We will have more moderates. It won't be such a rare breed, but we'll have people that represent their communities, and that's really what this is about. And if we can do that, then we'll have a representation in the General Assembly and in Congress that looks like and thinks like the populace, which I think would mean better policy, better people willing to run, and competitive in some areas, and just overall a better assembly and better policy. So with that, I will say thank you all very, very much for participating in this. I will email everyone, but you can always ask questions or get involved if you want to email director@onevirginia2021. I'll be happy to connect you with John. John, do you want to say your email address?
Sure. jliss@newvirginiamajority.org. All one word, newvirginiamajority.org. jliss, J-L-I-S-S.
Great. And so jliss@newvirginiamajority.org, and then director@onevirginia2021.org. We'd be happy to connect you. Anything you need, please ask. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Good night.
Good night.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
All right.
So how